There are two ways to close a mouth. One involves actually what we call a needle injector. So this is normally going into bone. So the wire holds it in place. Hello, I'm Victor M. Sweeney, licensed funeral director and mortician, and this is part 2 of Mortician Support. All right, first up, here's a question from lovely Nicole. How do morticians get into their profession? Like, what inspired them or whatnot to want to pursue that career? That is such a fine question. It differs from mortician to mortician. Decades ago, it used to be more common that a funeral home was a family business. So it might be that your dad was a mortician and your grandpa before him, and you just follow in their footsteps to carry on that family business and keep up the family name. Today, most morticians are what we might call first-generation funeral directors. So they're going into it cold, they're learning the trade, and then going off on their own to either work for somebody or own their own funeral home. For myself, I always grew up kind of surrounded by death, if you will. I found my best friend dead in his bed when I was 4. I had a sister that was born before me that passed away, and we'd always visit her grave. And then for about 10 years when I was a kid, we lost a close family member, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, every year for about a decade. So I was around funerals a whole lot. It made me understand that this is something important and worth doing. Here's a question from Anthony Pyle. Can you be buried according to your heritage or beliefs? In Colorado, for instance, there is one county that actually allows burial outside on a pyre. So you could build a burial pyre out of wood and light up Grandpa if you were in that county and you had proper write-off from the government. Next up, we have from a total random, why do dead bodies get stiff? The proper term for the stiffening of bodies after death is called rigor mortis. So this would be when the muscles of the body tense up until the tissues themselves start to break down a little bit. So if a body is in rigor, and we don't want it to be, the best thing that we can do is what's called breaking rigor. Typically, you're gonna see rigor mortis in the joints is where it's primarily gonna be a problem. So to break rigor, all you actually have to do is manipulate those joints forcefully. And I'm talking bending those fingers way, way back. And after you do that a number of times, they'll loosen up. So then you can have the hands positioned properly. Our next question is from Alicia Wood. Will morticians give you a shower? Asking for a friend. It's a fine question because really, we do bathe every deceased that comes through. So we'll wash their bodies, we'll shampoo their hair. But for your question, giving a shower, I cannot imagine trying to prop somebody up, trying to make that happen. Having them laying on a table and doing it while they're laying down and I don't have to hold them up with one arm is definitely ideal. Here's a question from Sovereign Insane. If somebody wished to be turned into a life-size doll after death, would it be legal? Absolutely not. Here's a question from VV Capitalism. How do morticians fix a body that was shot between the eyes? Like they just fill it in with silly putty? One of the things that we do and we work very hard on is what we call restoration. When someone's shot between the eyes, provided the rest of their head is there and we just have a bullet hole, first we'd probably want to pack it with cotton or some other firmer material. And then on the topmost layer, we're going to cover it with what's called wax. This wax is called a surface restorer. So I'll show you how it works. So we have a wax, it's softer than candle wax, but when it's introduced to the heat of the hand, it tends to soften up. And then this wax we can use to wax over a wound. See how it covers it just like that? And then we can get the proper texture with stippling and with brushwork, and then color over it after that and try to blend it in. Here's a question from Genealogy Jill. Are sky burials legal in the United States? So a sky burial is where you leave a body out on a high place for vultures and other animals to pick apart. It is not legal. Here's a question from Kelly Elizabeth. Ew. Do morticians really sew your mouth shut when you're dead? Hashtag the right. The answer to that is yes, and also no. You might be thinking that we're talking about sewing the lips. We generally don't sew the lips closed. You can imagine how much time and how much fine detail it would take to do that. There are two ways to close a mouth. One involves actually using suture to bring the jawbone up with a needle and some thread. This is a large S-curve needle. You would go up out of the nose, across the septum, back down, and then you're actually going to go through the frenulum of your lip here. There's usually a little piece of skin. You'll go through that all on the inside of your mouth. Once you do that, you can just pull the two ends together and it tightens the jaw right up. The other method of closing a mouth is with what we call a needle injector. We have a mouth here, and we're going to take this needle injector, and it's a piston, you see? It clicks. So this piston is going to drive our sharp brad into the wood here, just as a demonstration. So this is normally going into bone. So there's our bottom one. There's our top one. And then you simply twist them together so the wire holds it in place. Once the jaw itself is closed, the lips and the rest of the mouth take their form very naturally. Here's a question from Haley Hay. How do morticians do people they know's bodies? I could never. I actually do that pretty frequently. And honestly, it's kind of nice because you know the person, you know how they do their hair, you know how they do their makeup, you know how they like to get dressed. And here's a question from Ambrin. When viewing my grandmother for her funeral, I noticed her nose looked odd. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to have been squashed and carefully restructured. Is this a common occurrence? Ambrin, that is a good question, and I'm sorry that was your experience. I wouldn't say it's common, but it depends on the manner of death. So let's say someone passed away where they had a very quick heart attack and fell onto their face. It's possible their nose might have been broken, or maybe they laid on their nose for a number of hours and it maintained that squashed look. Then it would be just as simple as straightening it out, maybe putting a little cotton in the nostrils to hold their shape, and then embalming the body so those tissues hold their shape. Here's a question from Tiffany Payne. Do breast implants get taken out? 5 question marks. Short answer, no. Our next question is from Ot. How do morticians decide what to do with the dead person's arms? So that's kind of an interesting question. Traditionally, the hands are placed over the umbilicus, so over the navel, and almost always the hands are going to be positioned left over right. The reason being is that more often than not, by the time you pass away, you will have been married, so we want the hand with the wedding ring to be on top so people can see it. But maybe the variation on that is if we have someone who's very large and in the casket, sometimes their hands don't quite reach up, or maybe they would meet, but it's so high up in the casket we wouldn't be able to close the lid securely. So if that's the case, we usually just put the hands at the side, typically resting just on top of the hips. Here's a question from Aaron Execution. I wanted to go into the field of work back in the day, but I was afraid of how it would affect me. What's one situation that's affected you the most, good and bad? Could that line of work cause PTSD? Well, the truth of it is, it can be a very emotionally taxing job. You do see a lot of things that you just don't want to see. Graphic injury, increasingly decaying bodies, burying children. All those things are really, really, really hard. But there are a lot of good things too. For instance, when you come across a situation like that, you're in a position to actually help a family in a way that really nobody else can. As for it causing PTSD, maybe. I think it depends on the person. But I think if you put the idea that you're there to help first, kind of before your own emotional investment in it, that's probably the ticket to keeping you free of those kind of debilitating anxieties. Next up, we have a question from Horror of the Orient. Why do dead bodies have to be prepared and shit? Just toss me into the ocean. Why is it so complicated? Just drop me in and let the orcas eat me. That could possibly be an option if we're talking about burial at sea. The reason we prepare bodies is to provide time for families to gather. More often than not, states are going to have a limit between the time a person passes away and when they have to be either buried or cremated. With embalming, it actually negates the necessity to bury a person right away. So let's say we're having a funeral, and we have families coming from both sides of the country. Hard to do that in 72 hours, let's say. If we embalm a body, then we don't have to worry so much about the timing, and we can delay it a little bit if we need to. I don't have a great deal of experience with burial at sea, being in the most landlocked state in the country. but there are protocols for shrouding and wrapping and then disposing of a body a certain number of miles out on the coast. So that way, when it goes overboard, it doesn't wash up on shore, and the orcas get to eat you just as you wished. Here's the next question from $. Do morticians really remove all the inside organs and put them at the foot of the dead person in the casket? Or is that a lie? Thankfully, that is an outright lie. Typically with an embalming, we don't have to remove the organs at all. They can just stay right in the body. Even if we have an autopsy in which the organs have been removed for study, they're typically placed back in the body cavity. So putting them in a bag at the end, not gonna happen. And at any rate, it's a huge liability. What if it broke open? Or what if it was just sloshing around in the end as you carried the casket out? You don't want that. We don't want that. No. Our next question is from Frantic Woman. Can morticians put facial expressions on the dead? That is a great question. Yes, more or less. So typically a person's facial expression will almost make itself when we close the jaw and set the features. Now, there are things we can do to help create a more pleasant expression. Things like filling in some of the cheek. Let's say they've gotten older, maybe losing some of their muscle tone. We can fill in the cheek with some cotton or possibly some fluid that we can inject in to bulk it up a little bit. One of the things that I always do is I put a little bit of cotton inside the mouth under the turn at your mouth when you smile. In my experience, generally people that smile more have nicer expressions when they're in the casket, and people that are frowners, they tend to frown in the casket as well. Here's a question from Jordan. Are all morticians this hot? The short answer to that is no. I usually look like a pasty, stringy, just stereotypical mortician, but when they put me in front of the lights with a studio magic, I look very handsome. Our next question is from Elian. Hey, I have a question. What do you do if a person has died in some kind of accident and has a severe injury? For example, lost a limb. Do you fix the part of the body that was injured, decapitated, or do you simply put it back? Asking out of curiosity. Really, Elian, it depends on the type of injury and maybe the magnitude of it. So if someone loses a limb, let's say, if the limb is relatively intact apart from being severed from the body, we can re-articulate it and actually just sew up all the tissue around it, making sure it's properly embalmed. I have not, thankfully, had too much experience with decapitation, but the way a person handles that, you embalm the head independently from the rest of the body, and then when it comes time to re-articulate the head to the rest of the spinal column, you actually drive a dowel into the spine and then set the atlas of the head, the rest of the neck, on top of that dowel so you know it's in the proper place. Then it's just a matter of carefully stitching up the two ends of the skin together and waxing over it. Here's a question from the Crypto Knight. Do you know why do dead bodies float? Yes, the reason for that is bacterial buildup in the abdomen that creates gas. That gas will cause the body to float. Here's a question from Dinah Jarrett. The 5-year-old questions. Why do dead bodies stink? Asked during breakfast, no less. Well, I have a 5-year-old at home, and this is probably a normal breakfast for me. Do you ever have meat or any other vegetable that goes off, spoils, or rots? That is exactly what our bodies do as soon as our immune systems stop taking care of us. You have a lot of internal bacteria living in your gut, all those hollow organs, and those things do smell bad. If a body comes in already smelling bad, already partially decomposed, typically we'll put that body in a body bag if they're not already in one. And then a good way to reduce smell is to actually use baby powder as well as baking soda. Both those soak up those nasty smells quite well as long as the body's in a sealed pouch. If we have an embalming where somebody is smelling bad, really the embalming itself typically will fix some of that smell. Ideally, the fluid will push out the blood, and a lot of times as soon as that blood is gone, the smell goes with it too. If someone is smelling really bad, a nice trick is just a little bit of Vicks VapoRub under the nose. The next question is from Jash. Is it possible for a mortician to allow someone to watch while they're working on a body? That is a great question. The answer is no, unless they are actually an intern. In most states, they won't allow anybody outside of someone who has a funeral director's license to enter into an embalming room, let alone watch the preparation of a body. Our next question is from R.L. Queen. How do hair and nails still grow on the body after death? That is an interesting question. The hair and nails do not continue to grow after death. There are no life processes that would cause the growth of hair or nails. The look of hair growing and nails getting longer is primarily from skin around them retracting. All right, our next question is from Lord and Savior Jared Gaines. I heard of a thing where you would die and you can have your tattoos preserved and given to your loved ones. Have you ever done something like that? I've never had that request, but I have looked into a company that does do that. So really what we would have to do is just remove that outer layer of skin. The company would probably send us a biohazard shipping container so we could mail that top layer of skin with the tattoo off for preservation and then probably framing before they would send it back to the family. Here's a question from Job for a Cody. So I do have a serious question. What are happening to the bodies of the deceased with coronavirus? Are they cremated? Are morticians wearing hazmat suits or something? That is such a good and relevant question. So when someone dies from coronavirus, they do not have to be cremated right away. We can embalm their body. It was kind of scary right away because I remember very distinctly handling bodies of people that had died of the coronavirus before we knew how it was spread. We always wore the maximum number of personal protective equipment that we could. So not quite a hazmat suit, but the next thing closest to it. Coronavirus is spread by droplet infection, right? By respiration from the body. Whenever you manipulate a body, let's say from the place of death, there is going to be some expulsion out of the lungs. Right as coronavirus started, we would start to shroud every body with a plastic shroud to contain in any sort of expulsion from their mouth, whether aspiration or just simply breath. You wouldn't normally think that would be a problem with a dead body, but as it turns out, we would always see kind of foggy condensation on that plastic shroud right around the face. And that's it. Thank you for all your great questions again. I was happy I could inform and teach you guys a little bit more about my life in the death world.